Who's Carrie? Chapter 3. He was big, and he was strong. He'd got his hands, smelling like tar, all over my face, and his elbows clenched against my sides to pin my arms tight. But my legs was free, and I began kicking back behind me as hard as I could, trying to get him in the shins if I could, and about the third kick I got hold of him good with my heel, and he cursed. The hands across my mouth was tight, and it hurt. I opened my mouth and snapped it closed, and I felt my teeth go into his flesh. He cursed again and snatched his hand off my eyes and gave me a terrible clout alongside my head that made me dizzy. Then he covered my eyes again. But in that couple of seconds when my eyes was uncovered, I saw Dan standing by the alley that led around back of the tavern. "Dan!" I screamed, and the hand clapped back over my mouth. This time he jammed a cloth in my mouth, and the next minute flung a bag over my head that come all the way down to my waist. He whipped a rope around the bag and pulled it tight so my arms couldn't move. I was trussed up like a pig, ready for market. I felt myself lifted up, and the next thing I knew, I was flung over his shoulder, and he was trotting off down the street. The cloth in my mouth was making me choke and gag, and the bag itched my face and made it hard to breathe. I began shoving at the rag with my tongue, and in a bit I got it out of my mouth, and after that I could breathe easier. I could shout too, but I didn't dare, for he'd know that I'd got the rag out and shove it back in again. All I could do was pray that Dan had seen me and would find a way to save me. Oh, I was scared and shaking and sick inside, so scared I could hardly think. But I knew what it was, a kidnapper. There was plenty of them around New York, and black folks had to be mighty careful about them, for they was always looking to kidnap some black person and sell them off to the South, where they'd work in the fields from sunup until sundown, hoeing tobacco or cutting sugarcane until they was wore out. Niggers was worth a lot of money. Dan figured I was worth 50 pounds in the West Indies, more in Virginia, which was more money than I was likely to see as long as I lived. And that was where I was headed. But all I could do was lie there over the kidnapper's shoulder, shaking and trembling, so scared and sick I couldn't cry. He carried me along for a ways, and by he stopped. I heard a key clink and a door squeak open, and then I was thrown down like a sack of corn, knocking the wind out of me and scraping my back. The door squeaked closed, and the key clinked in the lock. For a minute I lay there listening. I could hear a kind of muffled sound of carts rumbling along the cobblestones, and the squeaking of a pulley, and I could smell tar and the sea, so I knew I was down by the docks. That shook me even worse, for that meant they was planning to ship me off to the West Indies, where I wouldn't do nothing but cut sugarcane in the baking heat and dust for the rest of my life. In the West Indies, there wouldn't be no chance of escaping, and I'd never get back home and never see nobody again. The reason why I knew all about kidnappers and being shipped off to the West Indies and such was because it almost happened to Dan's cousin Willie, the one that Horace was in love with. Willie's ma had got terrible sick during the Revolution and had gone to live with Captain Ivers, who was master of Dan and his mother. They was kin to Willie, which is why Willie went there, but Willie's ma had died because Captain Ivers wouldn't buy her no medicine, and Willie had got into a terrible fight with Captain Ivers and had run off and ended up down at the tavern working for Mr. Francis, the same as me. But Captain Ivers, he put it out everywhere that Willie was his slave. He didn't have no proof of it, no bill of sale or nothing, but he said it anyway. The problem was that Willie didn't have no proof that she was free either. Her pa had got killed in the war, and her ma had died up there at Captain Ivers's place. Her pa had had papers saying he was free back up in Connecticut at Groton, where they lived before the Revolution, somewheres up in the old shack where they used to live. But that was a long time ago, and Willie figured the papers was long gone, and the shack as like as not too. She was supposed to get some papers from a judge up in Connecticut once, but she'd run off to New York, and somehow the papers never come. Without papers, nobody was going to believe her against Captain Ivers. He was white and she was black, and nothing but a girl, too. Nobody was going to believe her. Captain Ivers knew that as well as Willie did. He was bound and determined to catch her. And once, when she was out front of the tavern washing down the steps, 2 men come and made a snatch at her and tried to heave her into a wagon, but she got away. She knew that if Captain Ivers caught her, she would be a slave. She told me, "Nosy, I might as well be a slave. I got to go somewhere else where Captain Ivers can't find me." So she went off to Philadelphia. It was mighty sad for her and Horace. Oh, they wrote letters, but that wasn't the same. Horace, he always claimed to be a prince at writing, but from watching the way he jabbed the pen around, poking holes in the paper and blotching it, I could tell he wasn't no great shakes at it. And Willie, she was just teaching herself to read and write and wasn't no great shakes at it either. So they was pretty lonely for each other. Anyway, that's how I come to know what the kidnappers was up to, and knowing what I was in for made it worse than not knowing. Anyway, I was in worse trouble myself now. I listened some more, real careful. I didn't hear sounds of breathing or anybody moving around, and I figured I was alone wherever I was. I kneeled up, and then I stood, easing up carefully in case I was in a shed with a low ceiling. But I wasn't. I could stand straight. Then I began to shuffle slowly around, feeling my hands and feet for things. In a moment, I bumped into something. I felt it with my legs. It seemed like a box or a chest of some kind. I felt around some more and bumped into another chest, and then a bag of something. I knew I was in a storehouse, filled with things waiting to be loaded onto some ship. I was just cargo, like the boxes and bags. The rope going around me was pretty tight, and my arms was beginning to feel numb, and my fingers were getting stiff. My head was beginning to hurt where the kidnapper had clouted me, too. The first thing I had to do was get the bag off my head so I could see around a little, and then after that maybe I could spot something to cut the rope with. There was bound to be a loose nail or a rough edge of a hasp or something on one of the chests that I could rip the bag with. I sat down on one of them and slid my bottom along real easy this way and that, and in a minute I found something sharp, a nail that wasn't pounded all the way in. I figured, or maybe part of a hinge or something. I got off the chest and knelt down over it. Then, going as careful as I could so as not to poke my eye out, I bent my head over it until I could feel the sharp thing touching my chest. I hooked the cloth of the bag into it and jerked. There was a little ripping sound. I hooked the sharp thing into the rip I'd made and gave it a hard, steady pull. The bag began to tear open, and in a minute I'd made a nice big rip in it and could see out. It was dark in there and gloomy, and only a couple of small windows on either side of the door let in a little light. It was a storehouse, just like I figured, with chests and barrels and sacks heaped up all around, and a dirt floor. There was dust all over everything. It made the cobwebs thick as strings hanging down from the beams everywhere. The windows hadn't been washed for years, neither. I hobbled over to the door and took a look out of one of the windows, keeping back a little so's nobody could see me from the outside. I was facing a dock. I could see ships tied up with their long bowsprits sticking out over the street, and bales and boxes and things stacked up everywhere along the cobblestones that had just been unloaded or was waiting to be loaded on. Where was the kidnapper? I looked around the street. 2 or 3 men was lounging around the dock, a couple of them sitting on a stack of boxes. One hunkered down, mending a rope, another one leaning on the corner of a building, smoking a pipe. I had no way of knowing if they was just sailors, or the kidnapper keeping an eye out so I couldn't escape. I hobbled back away from the window so as to be out of sight, and stood there thinking. My arms was hurting worse and my fingers getting number, and I was still good and scared, but being able to see helped me a little. At least I knew what was going on around me.
Okay,